we've been working to increase the amount of renewable energy and reduce carbon emissions. Some of our projects include the Smart Islands programme, which has delivered solar panels across St Mary's, investment into geothermal heat and power, Cornwall's first smart grid connected wind turbine, which will power up to 1,400 homes, and a £12.9 million house retrofit programme to improve the energy efficiency of 900 of Cornwall Council-owned homes. Here are some local examples of businesses and groups tackling decarbonisation of energy across Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly.
It is a climate emergency, climate catastrophe, one might say. We have, for example, put photovoltaic panels, PV panels, on the roof of one of the buildings that the Parish Council owns and operates. Every summer we hold a green energy show where members of the public can come along and just see a whole load of green energy technologies. One of the many projects that Benham are doing with Chasewater Community Energy Group is we're going to be the hosts for the world's first biomethane-powered off-grid electric vehicle charger. As soon as you plug in, heat is generated as well because the motor starts up. That heat is put into a tank and heats the smallest of our 2 village halls. The urgency cannot be overemphasized.
We farm 100 acres at Cusgarn, all totally organic. Responding to the climate emergency is the most important battle we have to fight. So we're trying to reduce the need for imported food, and imported food is responsible for a huge amount of carbon. Our shop is powered by photovoltaic panels. All the buildings are, if they fell down, they'd virtually be completely compostable. We've put in a biomass boiler. We've let our hedgerows grow up 30 foot high or more. Message to the general population: just don't think about it, just do it.
So far, what Stithian's Energy Group has done is made of alternatives to heating their homes with fossil fuels, which is expensive. We have CIL funding from Cornwall Council to put on PV panels and a battery system onto the Stithian Centre. Stithian's Parish Council and Stithian's Energy Group have supported Kenza Utilities in a project called Heat the Streets project, obtaining £5 million worth of funding to put in a heat network, a ground source heat network that people will be able to tap into with individual heat pumps, and at virtually no cost to the homeowners. So it's a major step forward that I hope we can prove works in Stithians, and then for it to roll out to other parishes as well.
It's becoming increasingly clear that we can't afford to wait for government to take the lead on this. This is something that we all have to kind of accept as responsibility.
From energy efficiency and reducing our requirement for fossil fuels. So we have had solar panels installed, and we've got a solar battery which is just being installed today, which is fantastic. So far I think this year it's produced more than we've used, so it's also a sort of a net exporter to the grid locally, so that it kind of increases the renewable energy capacity that we've got here on the islands, I hope.
We're not using any petrol-powered equipment, the lawnmower, the strimmers, the hedge cutters, everything is now fully electric. There's lots of opportunities out there for some funding often, so it's worth having a look like what's out there in your area.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back. Our speaker in this session is Prina Samarina, who is a local energy coordinator from Regen Southwest, and the local advocate that will be joining the conversation later is Amanda Foreman, who is co-founder of Planet A Community Interest Company. So I'll close my camera down now, and if I could ask Prina to turn hers on and take her mic off. Hello, Prina.
Hello, thank you, Martin. So hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming to this. So like Martin said, I'm a local energy coordinator at Regen. So Regen is a not-for-profit organisation with a mission to decarbonise, decentralise and democratise our energy system. So today I'm going to talk to you about energy, the enormous change that is coming in this space and how we can embrace and be a part of that change to create a better society for everyone. So firstly, energy underpins nearly everything in our lives, and especially in the past few weeks, we've really seen this come to the forefront with hikes in the price of gas and therefore our energy bills, as well as shortages of fuels for our vehicles. And I'm sure you've all noticed these changes. So we need to make sure to keep the lights on, but we also need low carbon energy for travel, industry, agriculture, heating, and more. So energy not only has the potential to enhance our lives or bring it to a halt, but the way in which we produce energy is essential to decarbonisation, reaching net zero and averting the worst of the climate crisis. Luckily, we're not starting from scratch in our road to energy decarbonisation. In fact, the first wind farm in the UK was right here in Cornwall. And now there are over 700 megawatts of renewable electricity in Cornwall and the Isles of Cili, which make up 40% of the area's electricity usage. As we've seen in the video that was just played, communities across the region have been taking action to decarbonise through making changes and working with other local organisations and local authorities. So there's a huge amount of things going on in Cornwall at the moment. There's a huge amount of innovation at local university. There's research and development into floating offshore wind, geothermal, hydrogen. There's a smart islands project. There's projects in helping vulnerable customers to decarbonise, and there's loads more which I don't have time to go into. And of course, we have Cornwall Council and the Council of Isles of Scilly declaring a climate emergency and committing to net zero, as well as publishing a net zero strategy and climate emergency development plan. So this has all been really, really positive. Having said all that, the reality is we still have a long way to go with the real challenge ahead of us. So the next decade is going to be crucial to reduce our emissions. So nationally, we need to increase the amount of renewables we have by about 45 to 50 gigawatts, with billions of pounds of investment needed in new infrastructure and technology to reach our goal. And we often see this framed as a negative in terms of how much it's going to cost us, but this is also a massive opportunity to create a transition where we can create new industries, jobs and innovations, but do this with justice and fairness at the core. So in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, these new green industries could mean opportunities for ambitious young people to pursue careers in well-paid long-term jobs, as well as additional benefits for existing sectors. And what does this actually mean for the everyday lives of normal people? Well, it means lifting people out of fuel poverty, having warmer, more comfortable homes, less air pollution, and ultimately a habitable planet. So it's clear that we're going to need massive changes at all levels in how we work, live, and operate. And as individuals, communities, and businesses, we don't need to be passive in this change, but we can be active participants. So we can make sure that the transition here in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly is equitable and provides the associated kind of local, social, and economic benefits to businesses and individuals. And within this, renewable electricity has a key role to play. As I'm sure many of you know, Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly has really abundant resources that could be harnessed, such as wind and solar. But we also need to look into new energy sources, such as geothermal heat and the use of hydrogen to fuel transport and industrial processes. An example of where change is already rapidly happening is on the road. And with a ban on petrol and diesel cars by 2030, I'm sure some of you have already been thinking of switching to an electric car. And we've got quite widespread consent on EVs. And just 5 years ago, that would have seemed mad. So in the recent net zero strategy released by the government a couple of weeks ago, we have a few more commitments, including that the UK will be powered by clean electricity by 2035, as well as the ban of new fossil gas boilers by the same date. So these are also big changes that we need to embrace in a similar way to how we have done for EVs so that they become the norm. But importantly, it's about how we go about doing that to make sure that no one is left behind. So we all need energy, and we can all have an impact in reducing emissions from energy. So if you're a business, a great place to start would be the UN Race to Zero campaign for SMEs. So Regen, the company I work for, has committed to that. And it's not easy, but it does provide a really good framework to get involved and understand how your business can participate in a global goal to move to net zero. And as an individual, joining up with others in your local community via community energy groups or similar organizations is a great way to be part of a collective working to decarbonize the energy system through various projects in an impactful way. So thank you so much for listening to this really short intro into energy, and I hope we can have some interesting discussions in the next hour or so.
Thank you very much, Prina. And can I invite Amanda to put her camera and mic on? Hi there, Amanda. So for the next quarter of an hour, I'd like to invite the two of you to have a conversation around energy, following which I'll turn my mic and camera back on again, and we'll start to go through some of the questions that the audience are asking. So over to you, Prina and Amanda.
Thanks, Martin. Hi, Prina. Nice presentation.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you.
So while COP26 is going on up in Glasgow, and we're talking about local changes and contributions that can be made in Cornwall, really that big question of how we heat and power things is a huge question, isn't it? Where to start?
Absolutely, and especially on the heat front, it's such a big topic and one of the most important as well.
Should we talk a bit maybe about bringing it down to an individual level, because it's obviously a topic that we need to engage with everybody, from the domestic sector into residential homes right up to big business and farms, as we heard on one of the earlier sessions. So what people can do on an individual level is often something that might appear a little bit confusing. Where do you start? So that topic about using less within your home and the value of insulating your home to lose less heat.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's what I talked about in my presentation a little bit. It's about at these different levels and what impact can we have at those different levels. So individually, like you just mentioned, insulating is one of the biggest things that we can do, but that's also quite difficult. So even on a lesser level, switching to genuinely green renewable energy can be good. Switching to EVs, I think you've talked about this quite a lot before as well. And heat pumps are the new kind of thing that we need to be talking about as well.
Definitely, and it's all the rise in energy prices at the moment is really having an impact. But potentially one of the, dare I say it, positive things about that is that it does make everybody become a little bit more aware of what they're using. So one of the simplest things we can do is to switch our tariffs onto a responsible provider and make sure that we're channeling our money back into a company that's going to promote and provide more renewable energy and a clean gas network. So that's a big part of decarbonising that centralised scheme, but also looking at how we generate things locally. So we're really lucky in Cornwall, we've got such a great renewable energy resource. One of the major changes could potentially be in planning, couldn't it? I mean, how are we going to allow the integration of more renewables into Cornwall?
Yeah, and that's really interesting that you brought that up, because we, as I mentioned, we have at the moment in Cornwall, there's 40% roughly is from renewables, and we need to get to 100%. And so that's a huge increase in renewable generation that we need. And I think maybe what you're insinuating in terms of planning may be onshore wind a little bit. But so in the net zero strategy, there was one mention of onshore wind, but we basically need more wind and solar, but also the other aspects that like floating offshore wind is a really interesting idea, and is going really, really well at the moment. And also geothermal as well. So yeah, planning is we need to integrate kind of renewables into the planning, and make sure that we're building enough.
Yeah, you're right. I am making a sneaky comment about the onshore wind development there, because onshore wind is still the cheapest and most viable form of electricity generation, and it complements solar so well with the seasonal variation. So in terms of meeting that local energy demand, wind and solar is a fantastic combination.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you bring that up, because it's kind of seen as something that isn't wanted by the public, but in fact, the majority of the public do actually want onshore wind. So next door in Devon, they did a climate assembly, which was a representative of all of the people in Devon, and 80% of people said, yes, we would like onshore wind. So I think it's becoming, as we start to understand the urgency of the climate crisis and what we need to do, I think more and more people are realizing that the benefit of onshore wind and other renewable technologies.
Yeah, I heard about that recently as well, which is a really nice turn in events. I think this engagement with people on a community level, there's some really great community groups. I think we've heard from Stithian's community group and Chasewater as well, but there's some really great action happening within local community groups at the moment, which is going to be a fantastic point for people to get involved and learn more about what's happening in their local area and how they can get involved. You touched on geothermal as well. What do you think the impact of that's going to be on residents? Because that's quite a new thing to come into Cornwall recently, isn't it? And there's the project at Eden and the one at United Downs and down in Penzance, with a few more in planning, I think.
Yeah, I think it can be really locally significant, because Cornwall is a really ideal location for it. However, we're not sure about the scalability of it yet. So I think we still need to carry on with the wind and solar and make sure that we're really hitting those. But it has potential, especially we just need to find where we can use the heat from it. But there is lots of work going on, like you said, and really interesting projects within Cornwall.
And with the using of heat with geothermal, is that something that can be given as a community benefit locally? So the areas where they're being built, that heat can be used locally for some residential benefit? Is that something that can be discussed?
Well, definitely needs to be discussed, yeah, because there's potential to use it within heat networks and heating people's homes potentially. But of course, it all depends on the location and what's going on in each area and how people are already heating their homes, and if there's any other low carbon things going on. So it's quite a complex to understand it, but yeah, the research is there and it could be really beneficial locally.
Yeah, I think that's got such a nice engagement mechanism there. If there's some benefit for people locally with the adaptation and adoption and general agreement with these things going on in the local area. It was that there's so many people turning out in support of COP26 who are really calling out for real change, and that's such a growing movement, isn't it?
Definitely, and I think we're going to hopefully see that within more renewables and more accepting of renewables within local communities, because we see it as not necessarily an eyesore anymore, but actually this is a really cool thing to have in our communities. So hopefully we're seeing that switch, and a lot of community groups have been working on that for a really long time.
Yeah, and then you mentioned hydrogen as well, which is one of my favourite topics. We're big advocates of using hydrogen and generating hydrogen locally, and love to get hydrogen here in the southwest. There's not very many refueling centres for hydrogen at the moment. I think there's 13 across the UK, which really limits the uptake. Do you see that happening in the southwest in terms of bringing hydrogen down here? Because we're clearly talking about a really great wind and solar resource, which is great for generating clean hydrogen right here.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that you bring then, because hydrogen, when we produce it, it's quite key that it has to be green and clean. So we want it to be from renewables. And Regen recently did a study into hydrogen opportunities within Cornwall and the Isles of Cili, and there are definitely opportunities, especially within hard to decarbonise sectors such as maritime and large vehicles. So yeah, I definitely see there's opportunity, especially in the southwest, and we can make it from the surplus energy that we are creating from renewable energy. What's your opinion on it? What other bits do you think that we're going to use hydrogen for?
I want to see hydrogen. I think primarily for a road transport fuel is probably the best place to start, but as a gas for powering industry as well. It's just got a fantastic resource. So if we can generate clean hydrogen locally and use it locally, we can build those centres around industrial centres that are going to need that heat and power. So that really reduces a lot of the impact of transporting hydrogen around as well. But across Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, and I think you see it especially on islands, because everything is really prominent on an island, isn't it? You're so much more aware of your waste, of your impact, of the energy that you use, because everything is so confined. But trying to build these up into models of how we reach net zero, there's got to be an approach where lots of different technologies are integrated. And Planet A's view on hydrogen is so much about using it as a storage technology as well, where we can reduce the waste of renewables that are potentially generating at a time when that electricity can't be used. We can turn it into hydrogen and store it, and that also relieves pressure on the grid. So it's got a lot of benefits in terms of balancing the network and the time of use, and can be almost used like a battery.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that there's no silver bullet, and I think you mentioned this, like we need all this variety to make sure that we can reach our net zero goals. And also I think that's a nice kind of added on to actual, like, battery storage is also really important, and it's going to be important in the future when we need to balance and store that renewable energy and then release it when we don't have enough renewables on the grid at the time.
So I wonder what the next big impact is going to be that we're going to see in Cornwall in terms of this renewable strategy and developing things. Where do you think the quickest wins are going to be from here?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that the net zero strategy that's come out and implementing that, and the development plan document, is going to be really important, and how that is kind of rolled out. So I think making sure that it's done effectively and that will be really good. But ultimately, I think I talk a lot about communities getting involved and having that bottom-up approach. So we need to build more renewables, and that's for sure. And we need to have all these innovation kind of things going on at the same time. And so having those combined and having that collaboration between the communities, between these huge projects, like the floating offshore wind in the Celtic Sea, is absolutely huge. And I think that's going to be a really big thing in the future. And also they're doing testing at Wave Hub, and that's all really, really interesting. And on the other level, we've got to understand the fuel poverty aspects and people who are in more vulnerable situations, and making sure those people aren't left behind. So I think big wins for me, it's we've done a lot of the big wins, the easy wins. We've done a lot of the easy installation, for example. I think we're getting into the nitty gritty now, saying how can we make this transition work for everyone, and how can we really bring everyone along with us. So I'm not sure that answered your question exactly, but what are your thoughts on do you think there's any easy wins or big ones that we can do right now?
Yeah, it's a big topic, isn't it? I do completely agree with the community involvement thing, and there's so many great, we said earlier, there's so many great incentives out there at the moment, and community groups who are doing some really excellent work. So the building those models up again, especially in light of we don't have a feed-in tariff subsidy anymore, so the financial sort of investment angle isn't there. I think a lot of the big wins are actually with businesses. So anybody who's got a daytime a daytime electricity load, putting solar panels on the roof of those businesses, the industrial parks, that's a really easy win actually, because the payback for those are generally less than 5 years over a sort of 25-year project lifespan. So I think that's a really easy win for people, is to counteract those business daytime loads. There's a lot of available roof space, and the cost of putting solar PV on has come down significantly. So in terms of an easy one, that really is quite a straightforward one for businesses to participate in.
I think just quickly to add to that, also energy efficiency work. I think energy efficiency is really vital. We didn't talk too much about heat pumps, but energy efficiency and heat pumps work together and doing that to create more warmer, comfortable homes is a win-win.
Definitely, and in terms of protecting vulnerable people as well, in terms of the cost rise and the implication, then again, those two things make a great combination.
Thank you, Prina and Amanda. We'll go on to some questions from the audience now. Before I do that, I'd just like to highlight some of the things that the council is doing around energy generation. For example, the project that we have with Bannerman's to create biomethane from slurry on some of our council farms, which will eventually be powering some of our fleet of road vehicles, and also our own turbine that we've recently commissioned at Vent-on-Teague, which has its own battery storage within it, which is then enables it not to have to turn itself off when grid capacity doesn't facilitate the export of the energy it's generating. Some of the questions that I've got here, first one is from St Ives School. What is the most efficient source of energy in Cornwall?
Who would you like to answer that question? Do you want to start, Prina?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if I know the exact answer. I would perhaps say wind energy, because it has the highest capacity factor, which means that the most amount of energy is converted into electricity. So that would be my answer, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. It's wind by far.
Wind and hopefully eventually floating offshore wind, which will scale up our ability to generate hugely in the southwest. Next question is, how feasible is it for local networks to be established to enable power produced locally to be shared locally and avoid total dependence on the national grid?
I can take this one if you would like, Amanda. At the moment, it's very, very difficult, unfortunately, to do that. So it's possible in new developments, potentially. However, the regulations that we've got at the moment make it really hard to produce power and then share it locally. And that's just to do with regulations we have at government and Ofgem level. So yes, that would be my answer. It's a little bit difficult.
Yeah, it is difficult. There's actually, we're working on some projects with Weybridge Renewable Energy Network who are looking at that at the moment in terms of how we generate and use electricity locally. But we'd very much hope that with a decarbonised grid supply of electricity, we actually will be able to rely on the grid to provide carbon neutral electricity shortly. And that's one of the big challenges.
Thank you. Where can I find out about community energy groups? That's the next question that's come in.
The best place to do that is on Community Energy England's website. So or learning more about community energy, that's a really great place to go. And also, if you Google community energy and your local area, there might be something that comes up, and if not, you can always create one.
Brilliant. And the next question is, how could you find out what percentage of the power supplied by your supplier is renewable?
Good question. Actually, if you go onto your supplier's website, they have to provide a breakdown of that mix of electricity. So the majority of the major suppliers, they've got a mix. If we take our national grid electricity mix as a whole, we still have a lot of energy. A lot of electricity is provided by coal, and then by gas, and then by wind. So by choosing a supplier and signing on to a green tariff, you're still getting that grid mix electricity, but you're funding the integration of more renewables and clean energy onto that grid. So it's a really important question, and to find out what your supplier is actually supporting in terms of grid electricity.
Thank you. And the next question, are there any plans for all new housing or other buildings to include solar panels or other renewable energy?
Do you want to take this, Prina? I can, I don't mind.
You can go for this one.
Yeah, I don't think there are, but there is strategy in terms of changing the planning. At the moment, currently new builds are going up and they don't have solar PV or heat pumps on the houses, but this is all of the, there are green building plans that are coming out. There's the future homes strategy. So we very much hope that we're going to see this implemented soon. I'm not sure if there's a deadline on that actually. Do you know, Prina, if there's an integration moment where we've got to start doing that?
I don't think there is. I don't know for sure, but yeah, the future homes strategy is the closest thing that we've got to that, I believe.
Thanks. And the next question is one that's actually quite close to my heart. It's something that I'm often asking, although it hasn't actually come in from me this time, is when will the electricity grid be upgraded to cope with the demand for low carbon technologies? And I know that's a particular challenge down here in Cornwall, where we have the potential to generate far more renewable energy than the grid can cope with exporting.
I think that's the golden question, really. So I think there's a lot of work going into this at the moment, which we're doing as well, into understanding where networks can strategically add capacity so that we can build renewables. So I think it's an ongoing process. It's not like a one-off. There'll be a certain date when it'll be able to cope with everything. And so, yeah, it's an ongoing process. If you're interested in it, I'd recommend keeping up to date with what's going on, because they often do kind of engagement with stakeholders who are interested. So yes, there's no certain answer to that.
And the next question, again, another $6 million question, I think, again, this time from St Ives School. How realistic is it that all people will own electric vehicles?
It's got to be quite a realistic thing at the moment. Electric vehicles are quite a contentious subject. So right now they are much better than burning fossil fuels. We have no emissions from that, and as the electricity grid decarbonises, then the fuel will be completely carbon neutral as well. And the data's coming up, isn't it, Prina? You mentioned this in your talk, when we won't be able to buy fossil fuel vehicles anymore. So we've got an option, 2030. Yeah, so it's fairly soon, and there's obviously going to be a number of second-hand fossil fuel vehicles on the road for a few years yet, but there's other alternatives, and I think we've got hydrogen fuel vehicles, which we've touched on today. We've talked about the Benjamin project, which is providing biomethane as an alternative fuel, and there's other biofuels as well, like HVO, which is hydro-treated vegetable oil, which is a great alternative to diesel. So we're seeing all these things sort of progressing, and transport is it's an unsolved thing yet. So electric vehicles are certainly the most viable one at the moment, but they're by no means the only option.
I also just want to add, like, we don't all need to own electric vehicles. So, for example, where I live in Exeter, there's it's in Cornwall as well, is co-cars. So it's kind of community sharing of electric vehicles. So we don't all necessarily need to own our own one, but we can all kind of share as well. So that reduces the amount of cars on the road, because often our cars are like sitting idle for the majority of the time, right? We use it on a few journeys. And also the other option is also increasing electric trains and public transport as well. So we don't all necessarily, in the future, we don't all need to own our own electric vehicles, but we need to electrify our transport.
Co-cars is good, isn't it? There's one in Truro Station, and they've got e-bikes as well in Falmouth now. So that's really nice. I'm going to go and hire one of those and cycle around Falmouth. That's a great incentive, and it's obviously taken off in other areas like Exeter as well.
I was in Bude the other week for the launch of a co-cars up there. They've got 2 electric Zoes up in Bude now also. So and that was working in tandem with the town council, and I think that's the route to a lot of these projects. Is it's not necessarily down excuse me, Cornwall Council, but possibly working with town and parish councils. There's also the potential there to introduce these car share schemes. The next question is, what do you think will be the most effective techniques to drive behaviour change to reduce energy use?
Most effective techniques.
I think there isn't one, and I think this is quite a common thing. I think we need to use every technique we can, and because different things will encourage different people, and also so yeah, I think that's my answer. So it's not one, but there's a lot of, so community is one of the things that I say is if we work together, if we do stuff with each other and we encourage each other, then personally I find that much more helpful. I find it very difficult to do something by myself, but if I'm talking with other people and encouraging, and which is why I always like to encourage people to get involved in their local communities, because doing stuff together is much more enjoyable and also effective.
Yeah, I agree. There's so many different ways that people can contribute to reducing their own footprint. I think better public transport and more frequent public transport is going to really help in terms, especially for younger people, being able to get around. I think in Cornwall there's a real need for young people to feel free and to have their freedom, and they feel like they need a car for that. So perhaps, you know, with better transport links and again more community engagement and making it interesting and fun to be part of that decarbonisation movement is quite a big engagement tool.
Thanks, Amanda. Next question that's come in is, what are your views on how we deal with the intermittent production of renewable energy? That's, I guess, particularly targeting wind, but to a lesser extent solar.
Well, that's an easy one for me, because we talked about the potential for hydrogen to do that. So I think in terms of intermittent, you know make the most of it while it's generating. You turn it into something usable like hydrogen, and that can be stored and used at any point that it's needed.
Yeah, I think Amanda's hit the net of storage is the answer, and also producing much more renewable energy. So we need much more for this to work. At the moment, we haven't got enough on the grid.
Thanks. And the next question is around renewable energy in the home. How can residents best start to retrofit their homes, especially if they've got solid walls or live in older properties?
Yeah, this is something we're working on at the moment. Actually, is looking at what products are available. Solid stone properties are typically Cornish and generally have a lower energy rating on their energy performance of around a D or an E, and insulating those buildings is challenging. So using a breathable material is really critical, so that you don't increase problems with putting concrete on a stone. Cornish Lime is a really great company based in Bodmin that do some really nice breathable insulation, but funding this stuff can be a challenge. Karina, you probably know quite a lot about access to people for funding for this stuff, maybe?
Yeah, it's difficult, and I think it requires, especially with harder to retrofit homes such as the ones that you're talking about, it requires a little bit of research and time. So it's not just call this one person and get it done kind of thing. But I would highly recommend figuring that out and trying to ring some people who are experts and see what their advice is on particular scenarios. Yeah, I think what Amanda said is completely right on that.
It's good. Just going to add on that as well, that an easy win is fixing drafts. and making sure that your windows and your doors are airtight and that lofts are fully insulated. So walls and floors are a lot harder, but in terms of sealing everything up, that's a big one. So you don't lose the heat that you're trying to heat your home with just through a drafty or a bad fitting window. And open fireplaces as well, a huge amount of heat gets lost up through open fireplaces. So if you're still using a fireplace, replacing that with an enclosed, efficient, modern wood burner or something like that will really help as well.
Thank you. The follow-up question to that that's been asked is, many people worry about the cost of the energy transition, and how do you think the government and the private sector can work together to deliver this?
I think there's already interesting projects such as the one I think was referenced earlier in Heat the Streets, in where it's already happening. So there are private sector and government and the communities working together to kind of solve these issues. But we do need a long-term strategy from the government and long-term funding so that we can, the industry can react accordingly and make sure that there's security. But I think it has to happen. So hopefully, I think it will.
Yeah, and again, just coming back into insulating your house really well. And if we're switching to electric heating, which is going to be a big part of the future, a heat pump has a coefficient of performance. So for every 1 unit of electricity you're buying, you get back the equivalent of around 3 units in heat. But that's only cost effective when you're containing that heat. So really making sure that your building is as tight and efficient as possible really helps with that transition to keep the costs down. But there has been a bit of difficulty really with accessing funding, hasn't there, with the government schemes and the Green Homes Grant and things like that, which were available for a very short period of time, and then it wasn't very clear what was happening with that strategy. So clearer and longer term funding from the government is really necessary.
And there's also the challenge there that you may introduce a renewable heat source to your property, but that may actually then cost far more to run, which has the danger, particularly in social housing, of driving people into fuel poverty at the same time.
Yeah.
The next question I've got relates to EPCs. Are EPC ratings a good gauge for the homeowner to commit to different forms of renewable tech, such as heat pumps?
So I think our opinion on this is that EPCs are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they are what we have at the moment. And so, yeah, having an EPC C or above is kind of where you want to be. But when you're installing the heat pump installer should be helping you at the same time to understand whether or not your home is in the correct state. Because I think you're right that it could turn out to be more expensive if your home isn't insulated correctly. But if it is, then it should hopefully mean lower costs in the long term, because you should be having to heat your home less and let warm air stay.
And that's really where it comes back to that full house retrofit, rather than just sticking in a heat pump. People recognizing the fact that, particularly if it's in an older property, that they're going to have to do more than just rip out the gas boiler and put in a heat pump.
Yeah, not in every situation, but in many situations. I think it's very key to get the right advice when you're switching your technology over. I think there's a lot of people who want to do the right thing and move away from gas and into electric, but understanding the bigger picture is really key to making sure people don't get into financial difficulties as well. So it has to be a whole approach, a whole systems approach with the right advice, and there's some really great organisations in Cornwall who are providing that advice. So it is available.
Thank you, Amanda. And one last question as we come to a close here. What is the one thing that you would recommend to everyone that they do, above all else?
For me, I'm going to kind of avoid the question a little bit, be a bit abstract in this, but it's about changing our mindset towards this issue and towards the climate crisis. It's towards understanding the urgency, and so that in all of our actions, we can implement the most low carbon solution, and whatever that is in our businesses, in our communities, in our individual actions. And I think once we have that mindset where we understand the urgency of the climate crisis, then all of our actions will follow from that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely key. I'm going to throw out there one simple thing that people can do as well this winter is to turn your thermostat down by 1 degree. Instead of heating your home to 20, try it at 19. And if you get cold, put a jumper on or go for a walk. Really simple things like that. But it's those changes that every single person can do, and it doesn't cost you anything. In fact, it will save you money. So it's, little things, but also just being aware everything is an emergency right now, and we have got to take every possible chance we've got to make changes.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And thank you as well, Prina, for joining us this morning and giving up your time. And also thank you to everybody who's been listening and put in some questions.